cop waved at little black girl every day. But when she didn't wave back one morning, Officer James Parker had been patrolling the streets of Millbrook for over a decade. At 38, his once jet-black hair was now peppered with gray, a testament to the stress and long hours that came with his chosen profession. His blue eyes, once bright with idealism, now carried a wariness that spoke of too many late nights and difficult calls. Despite the challenges, James still believed in his duty to protect and serve, even as he struggled with the changing dynamics between law enforcement and the communities they served. Every morning for the past year, as James drove down Maple Street on his way to the precinct, he'd see her. Amelia Johnson, a vibrant 10-year-old with a smile that could light up the darkest day, would be waiting at her front gate, backpack slung over her shoulder, ready for school. Without fail, she'd wave enthusiastically at James's patrol car as it passed, her brown eyes twinkling with genuine warmth. Amelia lived with her grandmother, Rose, in a modest house that had seen better days but was always neatly kept. Rose had taken custody of Amelia after her parents were killed in a car accident when she was just 5 years old. Despite the tragedy, Rose had managed to raise Amelia with love and strength, instilling in her a sense of hope and kindness that seemed to radiate from her very being. For James, Amelia's daily greeting had become more than just a pleasant interaction. It was a reminder of why he had become a police officer in the first place, to make a positive difference in people's lives, especially the most vulnerable. In a world where tensions between law enforcement and minority communities were often strained, Amelia's simple gesture of friendliness was a balm to James's increasingly cynical outlook. What James didn't know was that Amelia saw him as more than just the kind policeman who drove by every day. To her, he represented safety and protection in a world that had taken so much from her at such a young age. Her wave was not just a greeting, but a thank you for being there, a silent acknowledgement of the security his presence provided. As summer turned to fall in the small town of Millbrook, neither James nor Amelia could have anticipated how their lives were about to intersect in a way that would challenge them both and leave an indelible mark on their community. The simple ritual of a wave and a smile was about to become the catalyst for a series of events that would test James's commitment to his duty and Amelia's unwavering spirit in the face of adversity. The morning of October 15th dawned crisp and clear, the autumn air carrying a hint of the winter to come. Officer James Parker started his patrol as he had countless times before, his cruiser rolling down the familiar streets of Millbrook. As he approached Maple Street, he felt the usual anticipation building. It was a small thing, really, but Amelia's cheerful wave had become an integral part of his day, a moment of brightness before the unpredictable challenges of his shift began. But as James neared the Johnson house, something was different. The usually well-kept front yard looked unkempt, with fallen leaves scattered across the lawn. More worryingly, there was no sign of Amelia at the gate. James slowed the cruiser, his cop instincts kicking in as he scanned the property for any signs of activity. For a moment, he considered stopping to check, but then he caught sight of the time on his dashboard. He was already running late for his shift briefing, and he knew his sergeant wouldn't appreciate another tardy arrival. Reluctantly, James continued on his way, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. Throughout his shift, James found his thoughts repeatedly returning to Maple Street. He chided himself for being overly concerned. After all, there could be any number of innocent explanations for Amelia's absence. Maybe she was sick, or perhaps she had simply overslept. But as the day wore on, the nagging feeling in his gut only grew stronger. As his shift neared its end, James made a decision. He would swing by the Johnson house on his way home, just to ease his mind. He told himself it was what any good cop would do. Checking on the welfare of community members was part of the job. Pulling up to the curb in front of the modest house, James immediately sensed that something was amiss. The porch light was on despite the afternoon sun, and the front door stood slightly ajar. Heart racing, James called for backup before cautiously approaching the house. "Hello? Mrs. Johnson? Amelia?" he called out as he reached the porch. "This is Officer Parker. Is everything all right?" The silence that greeted him was unnerving. With one hand on his holster, James gently pushed the door open wider. The scene that greeted him made his blood run cold. The living room was in disarray, furniture overturned and pictures knocked from the walls. Signs of a struggle were evident everywhere he looked. As James moved further into the house, his dread mounting with each step, he heard a faint sound coming from the kitchen. There, huddled in the corner, he found Rose Johnson. The elderly woman was visibly shaken, her face streaked with tears and a nasty bruise forming on her cheek. "Mrs. Johnson," James said softly, kneeling beside her. "What happened? Where's Amelia?" Rose looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear and anguish. "They took her," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They took my Amelia." James felt as if the ground had dropped out from under him. In that moment, all of his training, all of his years of experience seemed to evaporate. This wasn't just another case. This was Amelia, the little girl whose smile had brightened his mornings for the past year. As the backup he'd called for arrived and the house became a flurry of activity, paramedics tending to Rose, forensics teams combing for evidence, James stood in the midst of it all, his mind racing. He thought of all the mornings he'd driven by, exchanging waves with Amelia. Had there been signs he'd missed? Could he have prevented this if he'd stopped this morning when he noticed she wasn't at the gate? The weight of guilt and responsibility settled heavily on James's shoulders as he watched Rose being loaded into an ambulance. He knew that every minute that passed decreased the chances of finding Amelia safe. The next 48 hours would be crucial. As he gave his statement to the detectives who had arrived on the scene, James made a silent vow. He would find Amelia, no matter what it took. The little girl who had brought a ray of sunshine to his days needed him now more than ever, and he was determined not to let her down. Little did James know that this incident would not only test his skills as a police officer, but would also challenge his perceptions, push him to his limits, and ultimately change the course of his life and career in ways he could never have imagined. As the investigation into Amelia's disappearance intensified, Officer James Parker found himself working around the clock, fueled by a mixture of coffee, determination, and guilt. He had been officially taken off the case due to his personal connection, but that didn't stop him from poring over every piece of information he could get his hands on. It was during one of these late-night sessions, as James sat at his kitchen table surrounded by case files and notes, that a revelation struck him. He had been reviewing Rose Johnson's statement for what felt like the 100th time when a detail he had previously overlooked suddenly jumped out at him. Rose had mentioned that in the days leading up to Amelia's abduction, she had noticed an unfamiliar car parked down the street on several occasions. At the time, it hadn't seemed significant, just another piece of information in a sea of details. But now, as James's tired mind made connections it had missed before, he realized this could be the lead they'd been searching for. With renewed energy, James dove back into the files, cross-referencing witness statements and patrol reports. As the pieces began to fall into place, a disturbing picture emerged. The car Rose had noticed matched the description of a vehicle that had been reported in connection with several other suspicious incidents in neighboring towns. James's heart raced as he realized the implications of his discovery. Rose looked up, a flicker of hope crossing her features. "Officer Parker, of course. Anything that might help find my granddaughter." Over the next hour, James gently probed Rose's memory, asking about the unfamiliar car she had noticed and any other details, no matter how small, that might have seemed unimportant at the time. As they talked, James felt a growing sense of connection to Rose and her plight. This wasn't just a case anymore, it was personal. As he was leaving, Rose caught his arm. "Officer Parker, I know you're not supposed to be involved in the investigation, but I'm glad you are. Amelia always spoke so highly of you." James felt a lump form in his throat. "I promise you, Mrs. Johnson, I'll do everything in my power to bring Amelia home." His next stop was less official. James had a contact in the local press, a reporter named Mike Sanchez who owed him a favor. Meeting in a quiet corner of a local diner, James shared his suspicions about the larger trafficking ring. "Mike, I need you to run a story," James said, his voice low. "Not about Amelia specifically, but about the pattern of suspicious activities in the area. If we can get the public's attention, someone might come forward with information." Mike looked skeptical. "James, you know I can't run a story based on speculation, and if I cite you as a source, you could get in serious trouble." "I know the risks," James replied firmly. "But this is bigger than me or my career. We're talking about children's lives here." Reluctantly, Mike agreed to look into the story. As James left the diner, he felt a mix of relief and anxiety. He was setting things in motion that he wouldn't be able to control. The consequences of James's actions began to unfold faster than he had anticipated. By that afternoon, his sergeant had called him into the office, his face stern. "Parker, I've heard rumors that you've been poking around the Johnson case. Is that true?" James took a deep breath. "Yes, sir. I've been following up on some leads in my off-duty hours." The sergeant's face reddened. "Damn it, Parker. You were explicitly told to stay away from this case. You're too close to it. I have no choice but to suspend you pending an internal investigation." As James handed over his badge and gun, he felt a momentary pang of regret. But then he thought of Amelia's face, of the trust she had shown him every morning with her wave, and he knew he had made the right choice. This wasn't an isolated incident, it was part of a larger pattern, possibly the work of an organized group involved in child trafficking. The thought made him sick to his stomach, but it also filled him with a grim determination. Without wasting another moment, James grabbed his phone and called Detective Sarah Martinez, the lead investigator on Amelia's case. Despite the late hour, Sarah answered on the second ring, her voice alert. "Martinez, it's Parker. I think I've found something," James said, his words tumbling out in a rush as he explained his theory. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line as Sarah processed the information. Then, "Good work, Parker. This could be the break we've been looking for. I'll get a team together and we'll start running down these leads right away." As James hung up the phone, he felt a mix of emotions washing over him. There was hope. They finally had a solid lead to follow. But there was also fear. The realization of what Amelia might be going through if his suspicions were correct was almost too much to bear. In that moment, James made a decision that he knew could jeopardize his career. He couldn't sit on the sidelines any longer. Official orders or not, he was going to be part of this investigation. As the first light of dawn began to creep through his windows, James strapped on his badge and gun. He knew he was potentially crossing a line, but the image of Amelia's smiling face as she waved to him each morning steeled his resolve. He had made a promise to find her, and he intended to keep it, no matter the cost. Little did James know that his discovery and subsequent decision would set in motion a chain of events that would not only impact the investigation, but would also force him to confront deep-seated issues within the police force and the community at large. The search for Amelia was about to become much more than a missing person case. It would be a catalyst for change that would ripple through the entire town of Millbrook. Officer James Parker's decision to actively involve himself in Amelia's case, despite being officially removed from it, was not one he took lightly. He knew the potential consequences: disciplinary action, suspension, or even losing his badge. But as he climbed into his personal vehicle that morning, those risks seemed insignificant compared to the life of an innocent child. James's first stop was the Johnson house. He knew that revisiting the scene might yield clues that had been overlooked in the initial investigation. As he pulled up to the curb, he saw Rose Johnson sitting on the front porch, her face a mask of worry and exhaustion. "Mrs. Johnson," James called out as he approached. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I had some additional questions about the day Amelia disappeared." The next few days were a whirlwind. Mike's story ran in the local paper, causing a stir in the community. Tips began pouring in, some credible, others less so. James, now unofficially working the case full-time, found himself at the center of a growing network of concerned citizens and off-duty cops who believed in his theory. But not everyone was supportive. James began to receive anonymous threats, warning him to back off. Some of his fellow officers, worried about the attention the case was bringing to the department, distanced themselves from him. The pressure reached a boiling point when James's house was vandalized. The words "Dirty Cop" spray-painted across his garage door. As he stood staring at the graffiti, James felt a moment of doubt. Was he doing the right thing? Was his pursuit of justice for Amelia worth the cost to his career and personal safety? It was in that moment of uncertainty that James's phone rang. It was Detective Martinez. "Parker, we've got a lead," she said, her voice tense with excitement. "A tip just came in about a warehouse on the outskirts of town. We think it might be connected to the trafficking ring." James's heart raced. This could be it, the break they'd been waiting for. Without hesitation, he jumped in his car and headed for the address Martinez had given him. As he drove, James reflected on the consequences of his decision. His career was in jeopardy, his reputation tarnished, and he had put himself and possibly others in danger. But if this lead panned out, if there was even a chance of finding Amelia and other missing children, it would all be worth it. Little did James know that the warehouse would be the scene of a confrontation that would change everything. Not just for him and Amelia, but for the entire town of Millbrook. As Officer James Parker raced towards the warehouse, a secondary plot was unfolding back in Millbrook. The story Mike Sanchez had published about the potential trafficking ring had sparked a firestorm of controversy and activism within the community. At the center of this movement was Sarah Thompson, a local high school teacher and longtime advocate for at-risk youth. Sarah had always been passionate about protecting children, but Amelia's disappearance and the subsequent revelations about a possible trafficking ring had galvanized her into action. Sarah organized a community meeting at the local church, inviting concerned citizens to come together and discuss how they could support the investigation and protect their children. The turnout was overwhelming. Parents, teachers, and community leaders packed the church hall, their faces a mix of worry and determination. "We can't just sit back and wait for the police to solve this," Sarah declared, her voice ringing out over the crowd. "We need to be proactive in keeping our children safe." Her words struck a chord. Soon, neighborhood watch groups were forming, and volunteers were organizing safety workshops for local schools. Sarah's initiative was creating a network of vigilant citizens, all working together to protect the community's most vulnerable members. However, not everyone in Millbrook was supportive of these efforts. Some saw it as an overreaction, a panic based on unsubstantiated rumors. Others, particularly those with connections to local politics and law enforcement, worried that the increased scrutiny might expose other long-standing issues within the town. Mayor Frank Collins was especially concerned. He had built his political career on Millbrook's image as a safe, family-friendly town. The idea that a child trafficking ring could be operating under his nose was not just horrifying, it was potentially devastating to his re-election campaign. In a hastily called press conference, Mayor Collins tried to downplay the situation. "While we take all threats to our children seriously," he stated, his smile strained, "we must be careful not to jump to conclusions or spread unverified information." His words, meant to calm the situation, only fueled the fire. Sarah and her growing group of activists saw it as an attempt to sweep a serious problem under the rug. They redoubled their efforts, organizing rallies and flooding city council meetings with demands for action. As tensions in the town rose, an unexpected ally emerged for Sarah's cause. Detective Sarah Martinez, frustrated by the political pressure to keep the investigation low-key, began secretly feeding information to the community group. She saw in their grassroots efforts a way to keep the case in the public eye and potentially generate new leads. This underground collaboration between a dedicated detective and passionate community members added a new dimension to the search for Amelia and the fight against child trafficking. It was an alliance that bridged the gap between official channels and community action, creating a powerful force for change in Millbrook. As James raced towards the warehouse, unaware of these developments in town, the seeds of a larger movement were being sown. What had started as a missing person case was evolving into a catalyst for community activism and a challenge to the status quo in Millbrook. The quiet town was transforming, its citizens awakening to the power of collective action. And at the heart of it all was the memory of a little girl's wave, a simple gesture that had set in motion a chain of events that would reshape Millbrook forever. As the investigation into Amelia's disappearance intensified, the relationships between key players in Millbrook began to shift and evolve in unexpected ways. Officer James Parker, now suspended and working unofficially on the case, found himself increasingly reliant on Detective Sarah Martinez. What had once been a professional acquaintanceship was developing into a partnership built on mutual trust and a shared commitment to justice. Late one night, as they pored over case files in Sarah's cramped apartment, James looked up to find her watching him with a mix of concern and admiration. "You know, Parker," she said softly, "what you're doing. It's brave. Stupid, maybe, but brave." James smiled wryly. "Thanks, I think. But I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try everything to find Amelia." Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I get it. That's why I'm helping you, even though it could get us both in serious trouble." This moment of vulnerability marked a turning point in their relationship. They were no longer just colleagues, but confidants united in a common cause. Meanwhile, James's relationship with Rose Johnson, Amelia's grandmother, was deepening in ways he hadn't anticipated. He found himself stopping by her house regularly, not just to update her on the case, but to offer support and companionship. One evening, as they sat on her porch drinking lemonade, Rose turned to James with tears in her eyes. "You know, Officer Parker, Amelia always said you were her guardian angel. She'd wait every morning just to wave at you." James felt a lump form in his throat. I didn't know that," he managed to say. Rose patted his hand gently. "You've become family to us, James. Whatever happens, I want you to know that." These words struck James deeply, reinforcing his determination to find Amelia and bring her home. In the broader community, Sarah Thompson's activism was creating new connections and alliances. Her organization of concerned citizens had grown into a formidable network, bringing together people from all walks of life. One of the most surprising relationships to develop was between Sarah and Mike Sanchez, the reporter who had broken the story about the potential trafficking ring. Initially, Mike had seen Sarah's group as a source for his articles, but as he spent more time with them, he found himself drawn into their cause. "You know, Sarah," Mike said one day as they were planning a community awareness event, "I became a journalist to make a difference. I think I'd forgotten that somewhere along the way. Working with you, it's reminded me why I got into this business." Sarah smiled, touched by his words. "We're glad to have you, Mike. Your voice helps amplify our message." As these new alliances formed, other relationships in Millbrook were becoming strained. Mayor Frank Collins found himself increasingly at odds with his constituents, his attempts to downplay the situation backfiring spectacularly. During a particularly heated town hall meeting, a local business owner stood up to confront the mayor. "My daughter goes to the same school Amelia did," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "How can you tell us not to worry when one of our children is missing?" The mayor's fumbling response only served to further erode public trust in his leadership. Even within the police department, lines were being drawn. Some officers, inspired by James's dedication, began to quietly assist in the investigation during their off hours. Others, worried about the repercussions, distanced themselves from the case entirely. Sergeant Bill Hawkins, James's direct superior who had suspended him, found himself conflicted. He had known James for years and respected him as an officer. One day, he pulled James aside after spotting him near the station. "Parker," he said gruffly, "I can't officially condone what you're doing, but, off the record, I hope you find that little girl." James nodded, understanding the difficult position his actions had put his sergeant in. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot." As these relationships evolved and new alliances formed, the fabric of Millbrook was changing. The search for Amelia had become more than just a police investigation. It was a catalyst for community transformation, bringing people together in unexpected ways and challenging long-held dynamics within the town. Little did they know that these newly forged bonds would soon be tested in ways none of them could have anticipated as the investigation reached its climactic moment. The warehouse loomed before James, its dilapidated exterior a stark contrast to the bustling activity he could hear inside. Heart pounding, he crouched behind a rusted dumpster, waiting for Detective Martinez and her team to arrive. Suddenly, a scream pierced the night air. A child's scream. James's blood ran cold. He recognized that voice, Amelia. In that moment, all thoughts of waiting for backup vanished. James knew he had to act now. Drawing his personal firearm, he moved swiftly towards the side entrance of the warehouse. Inside, the scene that greeted him was chaos. Children huddled in makeshift cages, while men in dark clothing rushed about, clearly in the process of moving their operation. And there, in the center of it all, was Amelia, struggling against a large man trying to force her into a van. "Police, freeze!" James shouted, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. For a split second, everything stopped. Then pandemonium erupted. The traffickers scattered, some reaching for weapons, others trying to flee. Amelia's captor shoved her roughly aside and charged at James. What followed was a blur of action. James fired a warning shot, then found himself grappling with the man. They crashed into crates and equipment, each fighting for control. James could taste blood in his mouth, feel the sting of blows, but he refused to give up. In the distance, he could hear sirens approaching. Help was coming. He just had to hold on. With a surge of desperate strength, James managed to overpower his attacker, slamming him to the ground and securing his hands behind his back with zip ties. Panting heavily, James looked up to see Amelia running towards him. "Officer Parker," she cried, throwing her arms around him. "You came for me." James held her tightly, tears streaming down his face. "Of course I did, sweetheart. I promised I'd always protect you, remember?" The warehouse was soon swarming with police. Detective Martinez rushed in, her eyes widening as she took in the scene. "Parker, you crazy son of a... You did it. You actually did it." As the traffickers were rounded up and the children were safely evacuated, James sat on the back of an ambulance, Amelia by his side. The little girl refused to leave him, clinging to his hand as paramedics tended to his injuries. Reporters had already begun to gather outside the police cordon, their cameras flashing in the night. James knew that once the adrenaline wore off, he would have to face the consequences of his actions. But for now, none of that mattered. Amelia was safe. Mayor Collins arrived on the scene, his face a mask of shock and barely concealed anger. "Officer Parker," he said tightly, "I hope you realize the shitstorm you've just unleashed on our town." Before James could respond, Amelia spoke up. "He's a hero," she said firmly, her young voice carrying clearly in the night air. "He saved me and all the other kids. He's the bravest person I know." The mayor's face reddened, but he said nothing more, retreating to confer with his aides. As dawn broke over Millbrook, casting a golden light over the warehouse, James knew that nothing would ever be the same. The town's dark secrets had been exposed, and the repercussions would be far-reaching. But as he looked down at Amelia, safe and sound beside him, he knew that whatever came next, it had all been worth it. The climactic raid on the warehouse was over, but the real battle for Millbrook's soul was just beginning. In the days following the warehouse raid, Millbrook found itself thrust into the national spotlight. News vans clogged the streets, reporters camped out in front of the police station, and the town's name became synonymous with both tragedy and heroism. Officer James Parker, still suspended but now hailed as a hero by many, found himself at the center of a storm of controversy. While the public largely celebrated his actions, the official response was far more complex. Mayor Frank Collins, realizing the potential political fallout, called an emergency town council meeting. The atmosphere in the packed council chambers was tense as James took the stand to testify about his actions. "Officer Parker," the mayor began, his tone carefully neutral. "While we are all grateful for the rescue of Amelia and the other children, your methods have raised serious concerns. You violated direct orders, engaged in vigilante action, and potentially compromised an ongoing investigation. How do you justify these actions?" James took a deep breath, acutely aware of the eyes upon him. "Mr. Mayor, members of the council, I understand your concerns. I know that I broke protocol and disobeyed orders. But when I heard Amelia's scream, I knew I had to act. In that moment, I wasn't thinking as a police officer, but as someone who had made a promise to protect a child." His words seemed to resonate with many in the audience, but the council members remained stoic. James continued, "I accept full responsibility for my actions and am prepared to face any consequences. But I can't and won't apologize for saving those children." The council chambers erupted in a mix of cheers and angry shouts. Mayor Collins banged his gavel, calling for order. "This is not a trial, but a fact-finding session," he reminded everyone. "We will take Officer Parker's testimony under advisement." As James stepped down, he caught sight of Detective Martinez in the back of the room. She gave him a subtle nod of support, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this fight. The next to testify was Sarah Thompson, representing the community action group that had formed in response to Amelia's disappearance. Her impassioned speech about the need for greater transparency and community involvement in law enforcement struck a chord with many. What Officer Parker did was born out of necessity, Sarah argued. If our police force and local government had been more responsive to community concerns, perhaps this vigilante action wouldn't have been needed. We need systemic change, not scapegoats. The meeting stretched on for hours, with testimonies from various community members, law enforcement officials, and even some of the rescued children's parents. The complexity of the situation became increasingly apparent, with no easy solutions in sight. As the council prepared to deliberate, James found himself cornered by Chief Williams, his superior officer. The chief's face was a mask of conflicting emotions. "Parker," he said gruffly, "you've put me in one hell of a position. Half the force thinks you're a damn hero, the other half thinks you're a loose cannon who needs to be reined in." James nodded, bracing himself for the worst. But the chief surprised him. "What you did, it was reckless, insubordinate, and against every protocol we have," the chief continued. Then his expression softened slightly. "It was also incredibly brave. You saved those kids, Parker. Whatever happens next, don't forget that." As the town council's deliberations stretched into days, an uneasy tension settled over Millbrook. James found himself caught in a limbo, celebrated by many as a hero while still officially suspended from duty. Rose Johnson and Amelia became unexpected allies in his fight for reinstatement. They spoke at community meetings, gave interviews to the press, and even started an online petition calling for James to be restored to active duty. "Officer Parker didn't just save my granddaughter," Rose told a crowd gathered outside the police station. "He reminded us all what it means to truly protect and serve. He deserves our support." Meanwhile, Sarah Thompson's group continued to push for broader reforms, using the momentum from Amelia's rescue to advocate for changes in police training, community oversight, and support for at-risk youth. Mayor Collins, feeling the pressure from all sides, attempted to broker a compromise. He proposed a community policing initiative that would incorporate some of the reforms advocated by Sarah's group, while also reinstating James under a probationary status. This proposal was met with mixed reactions. Some saw it as a positive step towards healing the rift between law enforcement and the community. Others, including James himself, worried that it didn't go far enough in addressing the systemic issues that had allowed the trafficking ring to operate undetected for so long. As the town council prepared to vote on the mayor's proposal, James found himself at a crossroads. He could accept the compromise, return to his job, and try to effect change from within the system. Or he could continue to push for more comprehensive reforms, potentially at the cost of his career in law enforcement. The decision weighed heavily on James. He knew that whatever choice he made would have far-reaching consequences, not just for himself, but for Amelia, for Millbrook, and for the future of community police relations. As he stood before the town council, prepared to give his response to the mayor's proposal, James realized that this moment was about more than just his job or his actions. It was about the kind of community Millbrook wanted to be, and the role of law enforcement within it. The resolution of this conflict would shape the future of Millbrook for years to come, and James knew that his next words could tip the balance one way or the other. Standing before the town council, James Parker took a deep breath, acutely aware of the weight of the moment. The room was hushed, all eyes fixed on him as he prepared to respond to Mayor Collins' compromise proposal. "Mr. Mayor, members of the council, citizens of Millbrook," James began, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil. "I've given a lot of thought to the proposal before us. It's a step in the right direction, and I appreciate the effort to find a middle ground." He paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. He saw hope, skepticism, and expectation in equal. However, he continued, I don't believe it goes far enough. What happened to Amelia and the other children wasn't just a failure of one officer or one department. It was a failure of our entire system. A murmur rippled through the audience. James pressed on, his conviction growing with each word. I stand before you today not just as a police officer, but as a member of this community. And I believe we have an opportunity, no, an obligation, to do more than just patch over the cracks in our system. We need to rebuild it from the ground up. James then outlined a bold vision, a complete overhaul of the police department's training and policies, the establishment of a civilian oversight committee with real power, and a comprehensive community outreach program. I know this is a lot to ask, James continued, his voice growing more passionate. It will require hard work, difficult conversations, and a willingness to change. But I believe it's what Millbrook needs, what we all need, to ensure that what happened to Amelia never happens again. The room was silent for a moment as James's words sank in. Then, from the back of the room, a voice called out, I second that motion. It was Sarah Thompson, standing tall with a look of fierce determination on her face. Suddenly, the room erupted in a cacophony of voices. Some were shouting their support, others voicing their concerns. Mayor Collins banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order. In that moment of chaos, James caught Amelia's eye. The little girl was sitting with her grandmother, and she gave him a thumbs up and a bright smile. It was all the confirmation he needed that he was on the right path. As the noise in the room began to die down, Chief Williams stepped forward. If I may, council members, he said, his gruff voice cutting through the remaining chatter. Officer Parker's proposal is radical, yes, but after what we've been through, maybe radical is exactly what we need. The chief's support was unexpected, and it shifted the mood in the room. Even Mayor Collins, who had been looking increasingly uncomfortable, seemed to reconsider his position. Very well, that the mayor said finally. I move that we form a special committee to explore Officer Parker's proposals in detail. All in favor? The vote was unanimous. As the meeting adjourned, James found himself surrounded by well-wishers and supporters. But it was Detective Martinez's words that stuck with him the most. You've started something big here, Parker, she said, a mix of admiration and worry in her eyes. I hope you're ready for what comes next. As James left the town hall that evening, he knew he had set himself and Millbrook on a new path. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of real hope for the future. This turning point wasn't just about policing or community relations. It was about reimagining what Millbrook could be, a town where everyone felt safe, valued, and heard. And James was committed to seeing that vision become a reality, no matter the obstacles that lay ahead. In the months that followed the town council meeting, James Parker found himself on a journey of profound personal and professional growth. The once by-the-book officer had become the face of police reform in Millbrook, a role that challenged him in ways he never could have anticipated. As he sat in his newly established office, a small repurposed storage room in the community center, James reflected on how far he had come. The walls were covered with charts outlining new training protocols, community feedback forms, and a large calendar packed with outreach events and committee meetings. James ran a hand through his hair, now streaked with more gray than ever, and smiled ruefully. The past few months had aged him, but they had also awakened something in him that he hadn't realized was dormant. A passion for justice that went beyond simply enforcing the law. He thought back to the James Parker of a year ago, the officer who had been content with the status quo, who had seen his job as a series of rules to follow rather than a calling to serve. That James seemed like a stranger now. The transformation hadn't been easy. There were days when the weight of responsibility felt crushing, when the resistance from some of his fellow officers made him question whether he was doing the right thing. But then he would remember Amelia's smile, or receive a word of encouragement from Sarah Thompson or Detective Martinez, and he would find the strength to push forward. One of the most significant changes had been in his relationships with the community he served, where once he had seen a clear divide between us, the police, and them, the civilians. He now saw an interconnected web of people all working towards the same goal, a safer, more just Millbrook. James had made it a point to be present at community events, to listen more than he spoke, and to really hear the concerns and experiences of people from all walks of life. It had been eye-opening and, at times, humbling. He remembered a particularly powerful moment at a town hall meeting when an elderly black man had stood up and said, "Officer Parker, I've lived in this town for 70 years, and this is the first time I've felt like the police were really here to protect me, not just watch me." Those words had brought tears to James's eyes and had reaffirmed his commitment to the path he had chosen. Of course, not everything had been smooth sailing. The overhaul of the police department had met with resistance from some quarters. There had been heated arguments, threats of resignations, and more than a few sleepless nights as James navigated the choppy waters of change. But as he looked at the latest community satisfaction survey results, showing a marked improvement in trust between the police and the public, James felt a sense of pride and accomplishment. He picked up a framed photo on his desk, a picture of him and Amelia at her school's career day, where he had been invited to speak. Amelia's beaming face reminded him of why he had embarked on this journey in the first place. As he set the photo down, there was a knock at his door. It was Sarah Thompson, her arms full of papers. "Ready for the Community Oversight Committee meeting, James?" she asked with a smile. James stood up, straightening his uniform. "Ready as I'll ever be," he replied, returning her smile. As they walked together towards the meeting room, James realized how much he had grown. He was no longer just a police officer. He had become a community leader, an advocate for change, and a bridge between law enforcement and the people they served. The James Parker, who had once almost missed the signs of a child in danger, had become a man dedicated to seeing and hearing everyone in his community. It was a transformation he never could have predicted, but one he was deeply grateful for. As James stood at the podium, addressing the graduating class of the Millbrook Police Academy, he felt a sense of pride and hope for the future. The cadets before him represented a new generation of law enforcement, trained with the principles of community engagement, bias awareness, and ethical policing that he had fought so hard to implement. "When I first became a police officer," James began, his voice carrying across the auditorium, "I thought my job was simply to enforce the law. But I've learned that true policing is about so much more. It's about being a part of the community we serve, about seeing the humanity in every person we encounter." He paused, his eyes scanning the eager faces before him. "The badge you'll wear is not a shield that separates you from the community, but a bridge that connects you to it. Never forget that." As he concluded his speech, James caught sight of familiar faces in the audience. There was Amelia, now a teenager, sitting with her grandmother Rose. Sarah Thompson was there too, along with Detective Martinez and Chief Williams. Each of them had played a crucial role in the transformation of Millbrook's approach to policing. But it was the sight of a young cadet in the front row, her eyes shining with determination, that truly moved James. He saw in her the same idealism and desire to make a difference that had once driven him. As applause filled the auditorium, James realized that the story that had begun with a little girl's wave had become something much bigger. It had become a testament to the power of human connection, the importance of seeing and valuing every member of a community, and the potential for positive change when people come together with a common purpose. The wave that had once brightened James's mornings had set in motion a wave of change that would continue long into the future, shaping not just Millbrook, but potentially serving as a model for communities across the nation.